I've come here to Cairo to seek a new beginning between the United States and Muslims around the world.
That was President Barack Obama's 2009 landmark speech to Muslims around the world. 7 years later, have Obama's policies lived up to his promises? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and you're watching The Heat. Barack Obama entered office with a message of hope and change, and as Commander-in-Chief to a war he opposed. He is the only president to spend 2 terms at war, so now, as his second and final term comes to the end, how have his policies affected the Middle East? We begin today's discussion with our Tel Aviv correspondent, Stephanie Frieden. Stephanie, Obama began his first term with hopes he could usher in lasting peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. That has never happened. What went wrong, or what were the missteps made by the Obama administration?
Well, Anand, one of the major missteps was when President Obama came into office. He went on that historic Middle East tour. We just heard the landmark clip at the start of the program. He skipped Israel on that tour. Not only that, during that landmark speech that we just heard a bit of, and he talked about, as we heard, renewed relations between the U.S. and the Muslim world. He also talked about supporting Iran's right for nuclear energy, and he talked about support for the Palestinians. That set off, that along with skipping Israel on that tour, set off alarm bells within Israel's public and within Israel's government. Now, fast forward to more recently, negotiations between the United States and Iran, according to former Israel ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren, those happened behind Israel's back. Historically, the U.S. would talk to Israel about negotiations with an enemy country to Israel. That didn't happen. That being said, Palestinian-Israeli peace negotiations did happen during President Obama's tenure, but they fell apart very quickly. So, slight movement. But those 2 major missteps are the missteps that the Israeli public and the Israeli government have kept in mind throughout the President Obama presidency.
All right, and right now we're going through what is called the lame duck administration as we wait for President Obama to serve his term before President Donald Trump takes office. Any hope that peace will come in these last few hours? Is the Arab-Israeli issue less important for American policy makers than it used to be?
Well, any hope would really require a miracle. At this stage, 1 month left in office, very highly unlikely. That's after decades and decades the 2 sides have been trying, and they have not achieved a lasting peace deal. So it really would take a miracle. In terms of the importance of the Palestinian-Israeli peace process, it is important, but right now it's taking a back seat to the other issues, the other things that are happening in this region, quite frankly. President Obama, during his term in office, the Arab world caught on fire literally with uprisings from Libya to Egypt to Syria, which we're still seeing that's ongoing now. As well, that created a refugee crisis that the world is dealing with or trying to deal with until this day. And ISIL came onto or stormed onto the scene in 2013. That's something that the U.S. and international leaders are still trying to tackle. So is the Israeli-Palestinian peace process important? There's a saying that without peace between those 2 sides, there won't be peace in the region. But right now, it is not a top priority for the world and for the U.S. leaders. Anand.
Thanks, Stephanie. That's CCTV's Stephanie Fried reporting from Tel Aviv. Facing red lines and deadlines, will President Barack Obama leave the legacy he hoped for 2 presidential terms ago? To discuss all of this, we're joined by Raghida Dergam out of Beirut. Raghida is the founder and executive chairman of the Beirut Institute and senior correspondent for Al Hayat. Also with us is Hamoud Salhi from Los Angeles. He is an associate dean and professor of political science at California State University, Dominguez Hills. And from London, Abdel Bari Atwan, noted author and journalist, and currently the editor of Rai El Yum, a pan-Arab newspaper. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ragida, let me start with you. What does President Obama's Middle East report card look like to you as he comes to the end of his term?
Well, not very nice and not very encouraging. It's not a good report because there's great disappointment in President Obama. The Palestinians are disappointed in him because he didn't deliver on what he started out with, which is a Palestinian-Israeli deal. The Gulf countries are disappointed because he broke the traditional relationships. Egypt is disappointed because they believe, from their point of view, is that he embraced the Muslim Brotherhood. Then you have a lot of broken hearts and broken promises in Syria. This is where President Obama drew two major red lines, one on the chemical weapons and the other one on Bashar al-Assad must go, and he walked his way back from it. So the legacy of President Obama is not very, it's not a good one here in the Middle East.
Abdel Bari Atwan, what is your assessment of President Obama's Middle East foreign policy?
I do agree with my colleague Ragida. Actually, his legacy is a complete failure in the eyes of many Middle Eastern people. People will remember Mr. Obama as the one who promised he will solve the Palestinian-Israeli problem and he will establish the independent Palestinian state and put an end to the Israeli settlement on the West Bank. He never actually accomplished or fulfill these kind of promises. Also, people in the Middle East will remember him as the one who was behind the NATO bombardment of Libya, which actually, okay, maybe it has succeeded in removing Gaddafi from power, but actually created as a bloody anarchy in that part of the world. Also, when it comes to Syria, he never actually reached a peaceful solution to the problem, and at the same time, he wasn't actually decisive in his promise to intervene. So he lost the Syrian, he lost actually the Egyptian, he lost the Libyan. I don't think he won anybody, even in Iraq, when he said that the American intervention military intervention was behind the creation of the Islamic State. Maybe when he said that, actually, he did not win any hearts or minds in that part of the world.
Hamoud, if we look at these two terms for President Obama, perhaps the most significant event, or events, I should say, in the Middle East during his two terms was the Arab Spring. That was the wave of anti-government rebellions across the region. What did you make of President Obama's response to that?
Well, again, that shows to the extent how President Barack Obama also fell short on the perception or the expectations in the Middle East and Northern Africa. Let's not forget when this whole Arab Spring started, particularly in Egypt and Tunisia, Barack Obama came out and supported it. And New York Times, for example, also praised this movement, saw it as a means of change in the Arab world. But then things went south from there, a disaster to a disaster, and in part because the United States and President Barack Obama himself didn't take the proper measures or didn't take this movement as it ought to be, a movement that is pushing for democratic change, respect for human rights, and certain kind of human decency, particularly on issues of economic development, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian cause. That's sort of where it became very problematic. The answer that we've seen from President Barack Obama was really to support the status quo and to play the card of chaos, creating chaos or being a part of that creation of a instability, whether directly or indirectly. That sort of get us where we are here. The lack of decisiveness, the lack of support of a real, genuine interest, particularly at the beginning, Obama will be seen as someone who contributed to the problem more than tried to resolve it.
Right, we see chaos right now, but that was not how it all started. Ragida, President Obama came to office as the anti-war president. He was going to change course radically from that set by his predecessor, George W. Bush. But looking at this after two terms, I mean, is the Middle East anywhere near a safer place now than it was when he came to office?
Let us take one part of what President Obama has done. He responded to what the American public wanted and needed, and probably still wants and needs, which is they don't want body bags. They don't want to see blood of Americans. So what did he resort to? He resorted to drones. Drones do kill people, do kill civilians, do make mistakes. Some think of them as unethical, but he had to resort to them because they did not bring American body bags back home. They did not spill American blood. The civilians or others who were victims of the drones, they were not American. Therefore, the public did not scream. That's one. The other thing is that President Obama, he believed and put everything on hold, and he even turned a blind eye to massacres committed in Syria, to war crimes, to crimes against humanity, because he wanted to safeguard one of his most cherished accomplishments, that is the relationship with Iran, that is to put the nuclear deal with Iran up on a pedestal and not shake the grounds of it. That's why you never heard him criticize the Iranian action in Syria, despite the fact that the Iranian-made militias were fighting with the man he said he had to go, that is President Bashar al-Assad of Syria. You know, Americans have always felt very good about claiming that they could take the higher moral ground, and that was something that is it is a pride of Americans to say, yes, we can take the higher moral ground. I don't think they can say that now after what President Obama has done in Syria. So yes, it's in shambles. The nuclear deal empowered Iran to do more in Arab lands, therefore you have more wars. And of course, like Abdel Bari Atwan said, the Libyan fiasco is amazing. Yes, it's European first, but it's also American. And Egypt was saved, unfortunately, by a regime that would probably be called closer to the military regime, but it was saved from the rise of Muslim Brotherhood. However, yes, we have lots of problems in this part of the world. They are not the making of Barack Obama, but he certainly did not help.
Abdel Bari Atwan, how much of a priority was the Middle East for Barack Obama when he came to office? Did he get to the point where he realized that he was not going to score any big major diplomatic or political success in the Middle East, and therefore decided to move on to other foreign policy arenas, like the pivot to Asia, for instance?
You know, if we go back 8 years ago, for example, the priority of President Obama, which he explained in his speech in Cairo University in the beginning of his presidency, actually, what he said, my priority is to find a solution for the Arab-Israeli conflict. And he never actually achieved that, and he washed his hand and turned his back completely to the Middle East. Also, the other point is, it is true, actually, he signed he was behind the signing of the Iranian nuclear deal. But we have to remember, we have to be fair to this man. Actually, this kind of signature prevented a war, maybe a third world war in that part of the world, because the situation was very tense. So to his credit, actually, he managed to diffuse the crisis with Iran in that part of the world. When, yes, he turned his back to the Middle East, he realized that it is a very problematic area. He doesn't want to lose, actually, his Nobel Peace Prize. He doesn't want to be seen as, adventurous or military adventurous U.S. president. And he went to Southeast Asia because his country dependent on oil is shrinking, is not as it used to be. He realized that the Gulf region in particular will face a lot of problems simply because of the lack of democracy, the emergence of Islamic State, the internal actually problems. People are unsatisfied with their governments, with the austerity measures imposed on them. Also the war in Yemen. We have to talk about the war in Yemen. I don't know why Obama, for example, example, was absolutely silent when it comes to this war. About 10,000 people were killed.
Right.
The children are killed. Hospitals are bombed. So, you know, he fed up of the Middle East, and he decided to go to Southeast Asia, hoping that he could achieve where he failed in that part of the world.
Hamoud, if we look at Syria as an example, how did President Obama get it so wrong? As Ragida pointed out at the beginning of the show, you know, he drew these red lines on chemical weapons, another line drawn about Assad must go. None of that's happened. He got that seriously wrong.
He got it, but we also have to factor in the conditions and in the environment that President Obama is working with. Let's not forget that the intervention or the Syrian crisis is but a product of the preemptive doctrine that George W. Bush created before. So it is a continuity on that pattern. I think the crisis in Syria got more complicated and more complicated because of the fact that the United States continued to disengage a little bit with conscious, not getting involved in ways that one would have expected or not expected it. And second thing, giving a free hand or getting other surrogates to play a role that the United States thought will play on its behalf. And the third reason is to create an opposition that is proven time and again that is ineffective and unable to lead the Syrian for a democratic change, whatever that means. The United States, in doing so, has contributed more to the problem, as I said earlier, than resolving it. Now, the crisis that the United States has in Syria is linked to Iran. It's linked to the region as a whole, and particularly now with the regional sort of competitiveness that continues to exist between an Iranian pole and a Saudi pole, that the United States found itself sort of in a very difficult position, having to choose between supporting fully the Saudis or its Gulf partners and Iran, which proves to be a player that it needs to think about it twice and more seriously. So looking at Syria, I think the conditions, the environment sort of became very, very complicated for the United States. And for that matter, the decision, I think, remains whether to continue with the status quo, given creating a situation where, you know, the interests of the Syrian people are respected. And for that, the United States is still struggling and it's still not finding a way of how to work on that. And they believe that the status quo continuing to create this instability, the crisis that Syrian people are going, serves it. And it's more of a managing the things the way they are than producing results. And this is not to ignore the fact that there are plans behind designed to fragment Syria to serve other parties.
Okay, we are going to take a break right now. Much more on Obama's legacy in the Middle East when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. We're talking about Barack Obama's legacy in the Middle East. Let's get back to our panel. And Ragida, you know, you've talked about President Obama's relationship with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt. We've heard about what is going on in Yemen right now. Would it be fair to say that President Obama appears to be suffering from some kind of trust deficit in places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt? They just don't trust him there.
Yeah, absolutely they don't. I mean, to be honest with you, they can't wait for the day when he goes. In Egypt, they can't stand what Obama did to them. From their point of view, their point of view is very clear, that he embraced the Muslim Brotherhood and that he insulted the army of Egypt, he and his cabinet, that he insulted the Egyptian army. And you could feel the dislike, maybe hatred for what Barack Obama did. And as far as Saudi Arabia, they have no love lost for him, but it's not as strong of hatred like the one that the Egyptians feel for President Obama. From the point of view of the Saudis and the other Gulf states, they feel a sense of betrayal, basically. They just feel, we've been with you with this traditional relationship, we've been loyal to the United States, we've done everything you asked us to do, and all of a sudden you turn around, you go to the Iranians, you strike a deal, and you forbid us to be part of it. So from their point of view, the consequences of the nuclear deal are at their expense. Then there is Syria. I mean, Syria is really a point of departure, because I really believe that Syria is President Obama's Rwanda. You know, it is amazing to see an American president turn around and pretend he doesn't see what's happening in Syria. If I may add one more thing, take a look at what the Obama policy administration did in terms of the power of Russia in the region. Russia is a very powerful country here. The Russians are making fantastic relations now with Egypt, filling the gap, sitting pretty while the Americans are really second fiddle. The Russians are controlling the situation in Syria to their advantage. They are in strategic relationships, a strategic alliance basically with both China and Iran. They are doing quite fine while President Obama decided to lead from behind. All of these things didn't really produce a legacy that is to be mentioned in this part of the world as one to say, yeah, I remember what this man did for this part of the world. No, it's the other way around. What this man did at the expense of this part of the world, that's his legacy.
Abdel Bari Atwan, you talked a moment ago about the situation in Yemen, but if we look at what is going on in Yemen right now, in Syria, in Libya for that matter, at any point in these two terms, did you see any strong evidence of an administration that had a well thought out, strategic, grand plan for the Middle East?
No, to be honest, I never traced any sort of, a solid strategy of the Obama administration when we talk about the Middle East. You can see, he regretted that he gave the green lights for the NATO to bomb Libya and to remove Gaddafi, simply because of the anarchy which is spreading, the Islamic State or Daesh, which actually managed to establish a base there. When it comes to Yemen, it is, to be honest, it is an affront to the United States and to his administration here. The poorest country in the Middle East actually bombed, and for the last 20 months, and the American actually supplying the Saudi regime with missiles, with warplanes, with spare parts, with ammunition. He never said, enough is enough. We know that wedding parties were bombed, funerals were bombed, hospitals were bombed, schools were bombed, markets, open markets were bombed, and people are really starving there. The children of Yemen suffering from malnutrition. So this is the problem we are facing here. The American, the leader of the free world, the leader of the free world. So they never intervened to put an end to these kind of atrocities. The same thing we talk about in Syria in particular. He never reached a political solution. He never actually was decisive and put an end to this war. So the man actually is left everything to rot, and he is leaving a very, very dangerous area.
Hamoud, what did you make of President Obama's efforts to resolve the dispute between the Palestinians and the Israelis to try and get to a two-state solution? He did make some effort. He was rebuffed by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Was that just a token attempt? And to what extent, to be fair to the president, was he undermined by his own U.S. Congress here?
And that's the tragedy. I think one would think, as mentioned earlier by Al-Bari, how in his speech in Cairo, Barack Obama made the resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Palestinian-Israeli problem as one of his priorities. But I think what's happening behind the scene is that today Israel is the most benefactor of the conflict in the region. The Israelis have never been punished or shown clear consequences of their failure to resolve or to give the Palestinians the right to live as dignified people. In the meantime, you have facts on the ground that are changing. The two-state solution is no longer a viable solution. And if we were to have a solution today and buy that two-state, whatever that state is, and we still question it, whether it's a it's an S capital for the Palestinians or not. We're still questioning that. Where are you going to have it? A lot of change has changed in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and in part because the United States has made it not a priority, while at the same time serving the Israeli interests. The Israelis to the interests are best protected more than ever in the past. And then there is and what we've seen today, I mean, the idea of having, as always, discussion coming back, having Jerusalem as the state capital of the Jewish states. So these are real issues that Barack Obama failed to deliver. And in more ways than one, there is some blame on the Palestinians that the Palestinians have yet to put in their hands in order. The Palestinians that they put too much on the Oslo, delegitimizing the international rights or the human rights of the international community, and putting too much on the American to resolve the conflict. The Palestinian problem is serious, and the expectations that we hoped that President Barack Obama will do something in it has been sort of a big failure. If not, the Palestinians today, by any card you use, are worse than they were 8 years ago, and this is a tragedy that we seem to ignore time and time again.
Irregular, what is your view on that? Was this a missed opportunity for President Obama, or did he feel very early on in his administration that there was just too much of a risk to try and resolve this dispute between the Israelis and the Palestinians, a risk that he could pay for domestically?
Yeah, he tried. He certainly tried. One cannot say that President Obama and John Kerry did not try. They certainly gave it a good shot. John Kerry, the Secretary of State, went back and forth umpteen times. No, you're right. What you said is correct. The Israelis did not want the deal. I'm not so sure the Israelis want the two-state solution, and I'm not sure they will. But this was not the only, this was early on in the administration, the first administration. Thereafter, we don't really hear about that. What we see about, what we learn later about what happened in this part of the world, I should say, is that, for example, the rise of Daesh. This happened on Barack Obama's watch. There was no Daesh during the time when George W. Bush waged his war on terror in Iraq and beyond. But the rise of Daesh had a background. Maybe it started with what George W. Bush did in Iraq, but then that was, history would say, Daesh happened on the watch of Barack Obama. When you look at the rise of the battle of Aleppo and the battle of Syria, and Abdel Bari Atwan wants to speak about Yemen, and I agree that Yemen, any attacks on civilians must be condemned. Any war crimes must be condemned wherever they are. And the Yemen situation, of course, there is a background to it. The Iranian meddling in Yemen through the Houthis and beyond. And also this is an issue of the border security, the national security of Saudi Arabia, where Iranians were coming through Yemen to do what they had for their agenda. But in Syria, it is even, I mean, take a look at Abdel Bari speaks of the children of Yemen. They are not any more dear than the Syrian children. Right. Aleppo is not only a tragedy, I must say Aleppo is a cry of shame on everybody here in this Arab region and in the United States and Europe. And again, it happened on President Obama's watch.
Abdel Bari Atwan, Ragida Durkheim, Ahmoud Salih, thanks to all of you for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.